The alarm on my console screams before I even understand what I am looking at. Red light floods the control deck of Junction 11, the trade station I have managed for 6 years, and every screen in front of me locks onto the same feed. A human cargo hauler called the Quiet Harbor is being boarded. Not searched, not inspected. Boarded, with weapons drawn, by a Krelthane patrol wing that has no business being this far out on the rim. I grip the edge of my console and watch the live feed shake as the boarding party cuts through the airlock seal. My hands are cold. I have seen inspections before. I have seen disputes over cargo manifests, arguments about docking fees, even a few shouting matches between traders who hated each other long before they ever reached my station. None of it ever looked like this. 6 armored Krelthane officers move through the corridor of the Quiet Harbor, with their weapons raised, herding the crew toward the cargo bay. I count 5 human crew members on the feed, hands raised, faces unreadable. One of them, a young man with short brown hair, keeps glancing at the camera mounted near the airlock, almost like he knows someone is watching, almost like he wants someone to remember this. My comms officer, a quiet woman named Hannah Price, turns to me with her eyes wide. Her voice comes out in a whisper, as if speaking any louder might make the situation worse. "Sir, the Krelthane commander is broadcasting a statement. He says the ship was carrying restricted material. He says this is a lawful seizure." I don't believe that for a second, and judging by Hannah's face, neither does she. The Quiet Harbor has docked at Junction 11 a dozen times over the past 2 years. I know its captain. I know its manifest history. There is nothing on that ship that should bring 6 armed officers through its airlock. I open a private channel to the Krelthane patrol leader, a stout, scaled officer named Director Kessa Vorn, whose name I have seen on 100 boring trade documents, but never once attached to anything like this. "Director Vorn, this is Junction 11 Control. You are conducting an unauthorized seizure inside neutral trade space. I need you to stand down and explain your actions through proper channels." His response comes back almost instantly, clipped and certain, the voice of someone who has already decided how this conversation will go. "Station 11, this matter does not concern you. The Quiet Harbor is under Krelthane jurisdiction pending investigation. Stand by for further instructions." I want to argue. I want to demand he explain what jurisdiction a Krelthane patrol wing has over a human vessel registered under neutral trade law, docked at a station that answers to neither government. But the channel cuts before I can say another word, and on my screen, the human crew of the Quiet Harbor is marched out of their own ship and into a holding shuttle. I have worked in galactic trade long enough to understand power. Every species at this table has its strengths. The Krelthane have numbers and a long memory for old grudges. The Vexari have technology that makes most fleets look like scrap metal. The Doral Compact has wealth that could buy entire star systems. And humans, the newest species to sit among us, have always been treated as the unfinished guest, tolerated because they are useful, watched because nobody fully understands them yet. I have read the reports. Humanity has only been part of galactic society for a little over a century, a blink of time, compared to species that have been trading across the stars for tens of thousands of years. Their fleet is small. Their territory is modest. On paper, they should be the easiest species in the room to push around. And yet, I remember something an old trader named Felix Doran told me years ago, back when I was still new to this job, and still believed the galaxy ran entirely on logic and paperwork. We were sharing a drink in the station lounge after a long shift, and he leaned across the table with the kind of seriousness that usually only comes out after the 3rd glass. "There's a rule," he said. "Older than any treaty. Older than the assembly itself, maybe. Every captain who's ever traded near human space knows it, even if nobody writes it down anywhere official." I asked him what rule that could possibly be, expecting some old superstition, some traveler's tale passed from ship to ship until it became more legend than fact. "Don't anger the humans," he said, and then he laughed, like even saying it out loud sounded ridiculous. "I know how it sounds. They're small. They're new. Half the galaxy treats them like children who got handed a seat at the grown-up table too early. But every trader who's been doing this long enough has a story. A ship that vanished after crossing them. A station that suddenly stopped getting human contracts and quietly went under within a year. Nothing dramatic, no declarations, just things that stopped working out for whoever made them angry." I laughed it off that night, the same way I am sure 100 other people have laughed it off before me. It sounded like exactly the kind of story spacers tell each other to make a quiet shift feel more exciting. Humans don't have the numbers for a war. They don't have a history of conquest stretching back centuries like some of the older empires. By every measure the assembly uses to rank military strength, they sit comfortably in the middle of the pack. Nothing special, nothing to fear. But standing here now, watching 5 human crew members marched off their own ship at gunpoint by an officer who didn't even bother to wait for a proper investigation, I find myself thinking about Felix Doran's warning for the first time in years. I pull up the registry information on the Quiet Harbor's crew, partly out of habit, partly because I need something to do with my hands while my mind races. The captain is a woman named Claire Donnelly, mid-30s, registered out of a mid-sized human colony I have heard of but never visited. Her crew includes an engineer, a navigator, and 2 cargo handlers, none of them military, none of them anything but ordinary working spacers trying to make a living, hauling freight across a section of the galaxy that has never been particularly kind to small operators. I send a formal protest to the Regional Assembly Office, the closest thing this sector has to a governing authority, demanding an explanation for the seizure. The reply comes back within the hour, brief and unsatisfying, informing me that the matter is under Krellthane jurisdiction, and that Junction 11 should refrain from interfering in an active investigation. I read it twice, trying to find some thread of legitimacy in the wording, and find none. By the end of the shift, the Krellthane patrol wing has left the system entirely, taking the Quiet Harbor's crew with them, leaving the empty cargo ship drifting at my docking ring like an abandoned shell. I stand at the observation window and look out at it. Lights dark, airlock still sealed shut from the inside where the boarding party cut through. Hannah joins me at the window, arms crossed, staring at the same dead ship. "What happens now?" she asks. I don't have an answer for her. I tell her we wait. We file our reports. We let the proper channels handle it. The same words I have said 100 times before, about 100 smaller disputes. But even as I say it, something in my chest tightens, some instinct I cannot quite name, telling me that this is not a smaller dispute, that this is the kind of moment people remember years later, and wonder how they didn't see what was coming. I think about Captain Donnelly's face on that feed, calm in a way that struck me as strange even in the moment. Most people, staring down the barrel of an unjustified seizure, show something. Fear, anger, confusion. She showed none of it. She looked at the camera the way someone looks at a clock when they already know exactly how much time is left. I tell myself I am reading too much into a single expression on a grainy security feed. I tell myself the Krellthane have overstepped before, that this will resolve the way every other dispute on this station has resolved, with paperwork and apologies and a quiet settlement that nobody outside this system will ever hear about. But that night, lying awake in my quarters, I find myself running Felix Doran's words through my head, over and over, the way you replay a warning, only after it is already too late to heed it. Don't anger the humans. I close my eyes, and try to convince myself it was just a story, a superstition passed between spacers with too much time and too much liquor on their hands. But somewhere out past the edge of this system, a human captain and her crew are sitting in a Krellthane holding cell for a crime nobody has bothered to explain, and somewhere far beyond that, I have no idea what is already beginning to move. I do not know it yet, standing at that window with the dead ship reflected in the glass, but the silence that is about to fall over this entire sector will be louder than any alarm I have ever heard, and by the time I understand what that silence means, it will already be far too late to stop what is coming. For now, all I can do is watch the empty ship drift at my docking ring and wait for morning, and try to ignore the cold feeling settling into my chest that tells me Junction 11 has just become a very small, very exposed place to be standing. The silence begins the next morning, and it is the kind of silence you only notice once it has already been going on for a while. I wake up expecting noise, a protest channel flooded with angry human diplomats, a formal demand for the release of Captain Donnelly and her crew, a counterclaim filed by some human trade authority, disputing the legality of the Krellthane seizure. I expect anger, because anger is loud, and loud things are easy to track on a comms board. Instead, when I sit down at my console with a cup of bitter station coffee in hand, I find nothing. Hannah is already on shift, scrolling through the same silence I am about to discover. She looks up at me, and there is something unsettled in her expression, the look of someone who has been staring at an empty board for too long, and starting to wonder if the equipment is broken. "Nothing," she says. Not one word, no statement from any human authority, no protest filed with the assembly. Their trade office hasn't even acknowledged the seizure happened. I check it myself. just to be sure, pulling up every channel I have access to. Human colonial broadcasts continue exactly as they did yesterday, full of mundane news about harvest reports and shipping schedules, as if a Krellthane patrol wing did not just drag 5 of their citizens off a ship at gunpoint less than 12 hours ago. There is no outrage. There is no demand for answers. There is nothing at all. I tell myself this is good news. Maybe it means the situation is already being resolved through quiet diplomatic channels, the kind of behind-the-scenes negotiation that never makes it onto a public feed. Maybe Captain Donnelly and her crew have already been released, and the whole matter is being smoothed over before it ever becomes a real incident. But the dead ship is still sitting at my docking ring, lights dark, exactly where it was left. I spend the next 2 days watching for any sign that this is moving toward resolution, and what I find instead disturbs me more than the seizure itself ever did. Human trade routes through this sector begin to shift, slowly and quietly, like a tide pulling back before a storm nobody else has noticed yet. 3 separate human cargo lines that normally pass through Junction 11 reroute around the entire system, citing nothing more than routine schedule adjustments. A small human research outpost, 2 systems over, goes dark on its public communications entirely. No explanation given. None of it is dramatic. None of it would draw attention if you weren't already watching closely, the way I am now. But taken together, it forms a pattern I cannot ignore. A quiet withdrawal happening across an entire stretch of the sector, like a hand slowly pulling back before it closes into a fist. I find Mara Voss in the engineering bay on the 3rd day, elbow deep in a coolant line that has been giving the station trouble for weeks. She is one of the few humans who has worked aboard Junction 11 full-time, hired years ago when we needed someone who actually understood human-built equipment that had started showing up more frequently in our cargo manifests. She has never struck me as someone prone to exaggeration, which is part of why what she says next stays with me longer than it probably should. "You've noticed it too," she says, without looking up from the line she's repairing. It isn't a question. I ask her what exactly I am supposed to be noticing, hoping she will tell me I am imagining things, that the silence is nothing more than ordinary bureaucratic slowness. She sets down her tools and finally looks at me, and there is no humor in her expression at all. "You don't want to see what happens after we stop talking," she says. I ask her what she means by that, and she takes a long moment before answering, like she is deciding how much to tell me. "Most species argue when they're angry," she says. "They send statements. They file complaints. They posture, because posturing is safe. It lets everyone save face while things get sorted out behind closed doors. Humans aren't wired the same way, not when something like this happens. We go quiet, because we've already started deciding what to do about it, and there's no point arguing once the decision is being made." I press her further, asking if she actually believes there will be some kind of organized response, a fleet movement, a formal military action over the seizure of 1 cargo ship and 5 crew members. It seems disproportionate to me, the kind of overreaction that would draw far more scrutiny and condemnation from the Assembly than the original incident ever did. She shakes her head slowly. "It won't look like what you're imagining. It never does. Nobody's going to declare anything. There won't be a fleet massing at the border for everyone to see coming. That's not how it works." "Then how does it work?" She picks her tools back up, returning her attention to the coolant line, and for a moment, I think she isn't going to answer at all. Then, quietly, almost like she's talking to herself as much as to me, she says, "You'll know when it starts. Everyone always knows, eventually. The problem is by then it's already too late to do anything about it." I leave the engineering bay more unsettled than when I arrived, and over the following days, the pattern Voss described only grows clearer. Human shipping lines continue to reroute around our sector, system by system, in a slow and methodical withdrawal that never once announces itself as anything other than routine. I check every public statement from every human colonial office I can access, and find nothing. No outrage, no demands, no threats. Just silence, spreading outward like ripples from a stone dropped somewhere far beneath the surface. The Krellthane, meanwhile, seem entirely unbothered by any of it. I manage to get a brief channel open with a junior officer attached to Director Vorn's command, a young scaled officer who seems eager to talk simply because nobody else has bothered to ask him anything in days. The investigation into the Quiet Harbor's cargo is ongoing, he tells me, reciting the line like he's been told to say it a dozen times already. Director Vorn expects a full resolution within the week. I ask him what exactly the investigation has uncovered so far, What restricted material was supposedly found aboard a ship that has docked at this station a dozen times without incident? He hesitates. Just long enough for me to understand that he doesn't actually know the answer, that the official justification for the seizure is exactly as thin as I suspected from the beginning. The director has not shared the specifics with junior staff, he admits eventually. I end the call without pressing further, because I already know everything I need to know. There was no restricted material. There was no legitimate investigation. Director Vorn saw an opportunity to seize a human ship in a quiet corner of the galaxy, where he assumed nobody important would notice, and he took it, confident that a small, newly arrived species would have no real way to push back. What he doesn't seem to understand, what almost nobody in this sector seems to understand yet, is that humans have apparently never needed to push back loudly to be taken seriously. I think about Felix Doran's old warning again, the one I dismissed years ago as nothing more than spacer superstition. Don't anger the humans. I think about the empty trade routes, the dark research outpost, the silence stretching out across systems like a held breath. On the 5th day, I receive an unexpected message routed through an old trade channel I haven't used in months, from a contact I haven't spoken to in even longer. His name is Lucas Renner, an independent freight broker who has done business with both human and Krelthane shipping lines for the better part of a decade. Someone who has always struck me as cautious to the point of being almost paranoid about staying neutral in any dispute. His message is short, and the urgency in it is impossible to miss, even through the flat text of the transmission. Pull every Krelthane contract you have through next quarter. It reads, whatever you're owed, collect it now. I'm telling everyone I trust the same thing. Something is coming, and I don't think it's going to be slow about getting here once it starts. I ask him directly what he knows, what specific information has prompted this warning, but his reply only deepens my unease, rather than easing it. I don't know specifics, he writes back. Nobody does, not really, that's the point. But I've been doing business near human space for 11 years, and I have never seen this particular kind of quiet before. Not once. Whatever this becomes, I don't want my name anywhere near the Krelthane when it does. I sit with that message for a long time after reading it, turning it over in my mind, trying to decide whether I am witnessing genuine danger or simply watching an entire sector talk itself into a panic over nothing more than an unusually quiet diplomatic response. Logic tells me the second explanation is more likely. Humans are still, by every measurable standard, a smaller and less established power than the Krelthane, the Vexari, or any of the dozen other species who have been navigating these stars for far longer. But logic has never been particularly good at predicting fear, and the fear spreading through this sector now is not coming from people who lack information. It is coming from people who have spent years learning to read the warning signs of trouble long before it arrives, people like Lucas Renner and Mara Voss, who have seen something in this silence that I, with only 6 years managing a single trade station, have not yet learned to recognize. I begin quietly preparing the station for something, though I could not tell you exactly what. I review our emergency protocols I have not touched since I took this position, dusty procedures written for scenarios that have never once come close to happening during my tenure. I check our docking clamps, our shield generators, our evacuation routes, all the unglamorous infrastructure that exists only for the day everything else fails. Hannah notices the change in me, before I say anything about it directly. She finds me reviewing the station's old defensive protocols late one evening, and she sits down across from me without a word, waiting for me to explain. I don't know what's coming, I tell her honestly, because I owe her at least that much honesty after 6 years working side by side on this station. I don't even know if anything is coming at all. Maybe this all resolves itself quietly, and we never hear another thing about it. But I would rather be prepared for nothing than caught unprepared for something. She nods slowly, understanding in a way that doesn't require further explanation. We spend the rest of that shift working through old procedures together, refreshing systems that have gone untested for years, and somewhere in the quiet, methodical work of preparation, the unease in my chest settles into something steadier, not calm, exactly, but focused. On the 7th day since the seizure of the quiet harbor, Director Vorn finally issues a public statement, the first official word from the Krelthane side since the boarding itself. It is brief, almost dismissive in tone, announcing that the investigation into the quiet harbor has concluded, and that no further action will be taken against the vessel or its crew. There is no apology. There is no admission of wrongdoing. There is only a flat statement that the matter is now considered closed, as if 5 human spacers being marched off their ship at gunpoint was simply a procedural footnote, already fading from memory. I expect this announcement to finally break the silence on the human side, to prompt some kind of response now that the matter has, at least officially, been resolved. Instead, the silence only deepens. The crew of the Quiet Harbor are returned to the empty ship sitting at my docking ring, quietly, without fanfare, escorted by a single unmarked shuttle that docks just long enough to release them before departing without identifying itself. I watch Captain Claire Donnelly walk back aboard her own ship for the first time in a week, and her expression is exactly the same as it was on that first feed, calm in a way that no longer strikes me as strange at all. It strikes me, instead, as the expression of someone who already knows precisely what happens next, and is simply waiting for the rest of the galaxy to catch up. I send a message to her ship's comm channel, asking if she and her crew are unharmed, asking if there is anything Junction 11 can do to assist with repairs or resupply before they continue on their route. Her reply comes back simple and brief, polite in a way that somehow carries more weight than anger ever could have. "We're fine," she writes. "Thank you for asking. We'll be departing within the hour." I ask her, almost without meaning to, whether she plans to file any formal complaint about what happened to her and her crew. There is a long pause before her response arrives, long enough that I begin to wonder if she intends to answer at all. "No," she finally writes. "That's not really how this works. I do not understand what she means by that. Not fully. Not yet." But I watch the Quiet Harbor undock an hour later exactly as she promised, gliding away from the station and out toward the edge of the system, leaving Junction 11 and Director Vorn's quiet declaration of victory behind it. I stand at the observation window again, the same spot where I stood a week ago watching that ship sit dark and empty, and I find myself thinking that the silence has not actually ended at all. It has simply changed shape, moving from this station out into the wider dark beyond it, carrying with it something I still cannot name, something that Voss and Renner and Captain Donnelly herself all seem to understand far better than I do. I do not know yet that somewhere far beyond the edge of this system, in waters no scan on my station could ever reach, a single human vessel has already begun its journey toward us. I do not know that the silence I have been watching spread across this sector for the past week is not the absence of a response at all, but the quiet, deliberate beginning of one. All I know, standing at that window as the stars swallow the Quiet Harbor whole, is that the cold feeling in my chest has not gone away, and somewhere deep down, I am beginning to suspect it never will, not until whatever is coming finally arrives, and I see with my own eyes exactly what an angered silence looks like when it finally decides to speak. 11 days after the Quiet Harbor leaves my docking ring, the long-range sensors on Junction 11 pick up a single contact dropping out of faster-than-light travel at the very edge of our system, and every alarm on the station goes off at once. I am in my quarters when it happens, off shift for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, and the sound that pulls me out of bed is not the alarm itself but the sheer volume of it. Every klaxon on the station screaming in unison, as if the entire structure is bracing for impact. I am on the control deck within minutes, still half-dressed, and the first thing I see when I reach my console is Hannah, staring at the main display with an expression I have never seen on her face before. "One contact," she says, before I even ask. "Just one. It dropped out of transit 40 minutes ago at the edge of the system, well outside normal arrival lanes." I pull up the sensor feed myself, expecting to see a fleet, a formation, something that would explain the level of alarm radiating off every console on this deck. Instead, the display shows exactly what Hannah described. A single vessel, sitting motionless in the dark, far beyond any standard approach corridor, broadcasting absolutely nothing. "Identification?" I ask, though some part of me already suspects the answer before she gives it. "Human registry," she says. "Military classification, that's all we're getting. No designation beacon, no transponder signal, nothing. It's just sitting there." I stare at the small icon on the display, a single point of light representing a ship I cannot see, cannot identify beyond its registry, and cannot explain. I have read about human military vessels before, mostly in trade reports comparing fleet sizes and technological capabilities across the major powers. By every measure those reports ever gave me, human warships are competent but unremarkable, smaller than Krelthane dreadnoughts, less advanced than Vexari capital ships, nothing that should make my hands shake the way they are shaking now, as I stare at this single dot on my screen. And yet I cannot stop thinking about everything that has happened over the past 2 weeks. The seizure, the silence, the quiet withdrawal of human trade routes from this entire stretch of the sector. Lucas Renner's warning to collect every Krelthane debt before something arrived to make collecting them impossible. Mara Voss telling me, flatly, that I did not want to see what happened after humans stopped talking. I think about all of it, and I understand, with a certainty that settles cold and heavy in my chest, that the silence has finally ended, and this single, unannounced ship sitting at the edge of my system is its answer. I open every channel I have to the contact, broadcasting standard station identification and a request for the vessel to declare its intentions, the same procedure I would follow for any unidentified arrival. There is no response. Not a rejection, not an acknowledgement, not even the standard automated reply most vessels send simply to confirm they have received a transmission. Nothing at all. Try again, I tell Hannah, even though I already suspect it will make no difference. She repeats the broadcast, adjusting frequencies, trying every standard hailing protocol in our system. The result is the same each time. The ship sits there, exactly where it dropped out of transit, sensors locked on it, but offering no further information, no movement, no sound. I find myself thinking back to something Voss said in the engineering bay, about how nobody declares anything, how there is no fleet massing at the border for everyone to see coming. I look at that single icon on my display and understand, finally, what she meant. This is not a show of force in the way I have always understood that phrase. There is no overwhelming display of numbers meant to intimidate through sheer scale. There is only one ship, sitting silently in the dark, and somehow that single point of light unsettles me more than an entire fleet ever could. Word of the contact spreads through the station within the hour, and by the time I make my way down to the docking ring to check on conditions there myself, the corridors are filled with the kind of hushed, anxious conversation that only happens when people sense something is wrong, but don't yet have the information to understand exactly what. I find Mara Voss exactly where I expect to, in the engineering bay, though she is not working on anything when I arrive. She is simply standing near the main viewport, staring out at a section of space where no ship is visible to the naked eye, where only our sensors can confirm anything is there at all. You knew this was coming, I say. And it isn't really a question. She turns to look at me, and for the first time since I have known her, I see something in her expression that I can only describe as grief, layered beneath the calm I have come to expect from her. I hoped it wouldn't, she says quietly. I really did. I've seen this happen before, a long time ago, on a much smaller scale, a dispute between two colonies that should never have escalated as far as it did. I was young. I didn't understand it then either. I ask her what happened in that earlier dispute, hoping it might give me some idea of what to expect now, some framework for understanding the silent, unmoving ship currently sitting at the edge of my system. It ended, she says simply. Quickly, and quietly, and in a way that nobody who was involved ever talked about again. The people responsible for starting it were dealt with. Everyone else was left alone. It wasn't a war. It was never going to be a war. It was something far more precise than that. I press her further, asking what exactly that precision looks like, what I should expect this single warship to actually do now that it has arrived. She is quiet for a long moment before answering, and when she finally does speak, her voice carries a weight I have not heard from her before. I don't know exactly what happens next, she admits. I was never part of anything like that myself, but I know it won't look like an attack on the station, or on you, or on anyone here who wasn't responsible for what happened to Captain Donnelly and her crew. Whatever that ship is here for, it isn't here for Junction 11. Her words offer some small comfort, though not nearly as much as I would like. I return to the control deck to find that the situation has not changed at all in my absence. The ship remains exactly where it was, unmoving, silent, broadcasting nothing. Hours pass this way, the entire station holding its breath around a single unmoving point of light on our sensor display, and I begin to wonder if this strange, suspended waiting is simply what the rest of this incident is going to look like, an endless held breath that never quite releases. It is Director Vorn of all people who finally breaks the silence on his end, contacting Junction 11 directly less than 6 hours after the human ship's arrival. His voice, when it comes through on my console, carries none of the cold certainty it held during the original seizure of the quiet harbor. There is something tighter in it now, something I do not think he is entirely successful at hiding. Station 11, he says. What is the status of the unidentified contact at the edge of your system? I tell him exactly what I know, which is almost nothing. A single human warship. Registry confirmed. No response to any hailing attempt. No movement since its arrival. I ask him directly whether he has any information about why the ship might be here, whether his earlier actions against the quiet harbor might have prompted this response. There is a long pause on the channel before he answers, longer than I would have expected from a man who, less than 2 weeks ago, dismissed my concerns about the seizure without a second thought. There is no reason to assume any connection, he says finally, though his voice lacks the confidence the words are meant to carry. The matter of the quiet harbor was resolved according to proper procedure. There is nothing further to discuss regarding that incident. I do not believe him, and based on the strain in his voice, I do not think he fully believes himself either. I ask him whether his fleet intends to take any action regarding the human vessel, whether he plans to send ships of his own to investigate or intercept it before it moves any closer to the system. His answer, when it comes, surprises me more than anything else he has said throughout this entire incident. No, he says, we will not be approaching the contact. Krelthane forces will maintain current positions until further notice. I find this response more unsettling than almost anything else that has happened over the past 2 weeks. Director Vorn, who seized a human cargo ship without hesitation and dismissed every protest against that decision with cold certainty, is now choosing not to approach a single unmoving vessel sitting quietly at the edge of an otherwise unremarkable trade system. Whatever confidence carried him through the original seizure has clearly evaporated entirely now that the silence he provoked has finally produced a response. I spend the rest of that day watching the sensor display, along with what feels like every other person on the station who has access to a console capable of showing it. Conversations on the docking ring grow quieter as the hours pass. Traders and dock workers alike drifting toward viewports and sensor terminals, drawn by the same magnetic, uneasy curiosity that has had me staring at that single icon for most of the day. Lucas Renner contacts me again that evening, his message considerably more urgent than his last warning had been. "It's here, isn't it?" he writes, without waiting for confirmation. "I'm pulling every asset I have out of that sector immediately. I'd advise you to consider doing the same with anything you can move, though I understand a station can't exactly relocate itself." I ask him, somewhat desperately, whether he has any further insight into what the ship's presence actually means, what specific action it might be preparing to take. His response, when it arrives, does little to ease the tightness that has settled permanently into my chest over the past several hours. "I don't think it's here to attack the station," he writes. "From everything I've ever heard about how this works, that's not their style. But I wouldn't want to be Director Vorn right now, or anyone connected to that seizure, if even half of what I've heard about human protocols is true. That ship isn't leaving until it gets exactly what it came for." I ask him what, specifically, he believes the ship has come for, and his answer settles something cold and certain into the center of my chest, a feeling that does not leave me for the rest of that long, silent night. "Answers," he writes, "and then accountability, in that order, and not necessarily gently." The ship remains unmoving through the entire night, and into the following morning, and I find myself growing strangely accustomed to its presence on my display, the way you grow accustomed to a held breath after holding it long enough that the discomfort becomes simply part of how you exist. Hannah and I take turns monitoring the contact in shifts, neither of us quite willing to leave the control deck for long, as though our continued watching might somehow influence whatever happens next. It is on the second day of the ship's silent vigil that something finally changes. At 0600 station time, without any warning signal or change in its sensor signature, the vessel begins to move, advancing slowly and deliberately into the system, on a course that I do not need a navigation computer to recognize will bring it directly toward Junction 11. I stand at my console, watching that single point of light begin its approach, and I think about everything that has led to this moment: the seizure of the quiet harbor, the silence that followed, Captain Donnelly's calm, certain expression as she walked back aboard her ship, Mara Voss's grief at the engineering bay viewport, Lucas Renner's warning, repeated twice now, about answers and accountability, arriving in that order, and not necessarily gently. I do not know exactly what is coming, but as that single ship continues its slow, unhurried approach toward my station, broadcasting nothing, demanding nothing, simply moving forward with the absolute certainty of something that has already decided exactly what it intends to do, I understand at last what Felix Doran was trying to tell me all those years ago in the station lounge, what every spacer who has ever repeated that old warning to a newer colleague has always understood long before they ever had to see it for themselves. Don't anger the humans, not because of what they will say, not because of how loudly they will protest, or how large a fleet they will send, or how dramatically they will posture before taking action, but because, when they finally decide to respond, they will do so with a quiet, patient certainty that is far more unsettling than any amount of shouting could ever be. And by the time you understand exactly what that response looks like, it will already be standing at your door. I watch the ship continue its approach, and somewhere deep in my chest, beneath the fear that has not left me since that first alarm sounded, I find myself simply waiting to finally understand what comes next. The human warship reaches standard docking range of Junction 11 a little past noon, and instead of demanding clearance, instead of issuing any kind of ultimatum or warning, it simply requests permission to send a single shuttle aboard. The request arrives through a clean, formal channel, polite, in a way that feels almost out of place, given everything that has led up to this moment. Hannah reads it aloud to me from her console, her voice carrying a note of disbelief that mirrors exactly what I am feeling. "They're asking permission," she says, "like any other visiting vessel." I grant the request immediately, because refusing seems both pointless and unwise, and because some part of me wants to finally understand what exactly has been sitting at the edge of my system for the past 2 days. I order the docking ring cleared of non-essential personnel and make my way down myself, along with Hannah and 2 members of station security, to greet whoever is about to step off that shuttle. The shuttle itself is unremarkable, sleek and efficient in a way that matches everything else I have come to expect from human engineering. Nothing about its design suggesting the kind of overwhelming force that has had this entire sector holding its breath for the better part of 2 weeks. It docks smoothly, the airlock cycling with quiet precision, and when the door finally opens, only one person steps through. She is tall, perhaps in her late 40s, dressed in a simple gray uniform, without excessive decoration or rank insignia beyond a small insignia at her collar. Her expression is calm, almost gentle, nothing about her bearing suggesting the kind of authority that could command a vessel capable of bringing an entire sector to a standstill simply by sitting motionless at its edge. She introduces herself as Eleanor Whitfield, representative of the vessel currently stationed beyond my docking ring, and her voice carries the same unhurried, deliberate calm that I remember from Captain Donnelly's brief messages 2 weeks ago. She does not raise it. She does not need to. "Thank you for receiving us," she says, extending a hand, which I shake despite the unease still sitting heavy in my chest. "I understand the past 2 weeks have been difficult for your station. I apologize for any uncertainty our presence has caused." I find myself oddly disarmed by the apology, given everything I have come to expect leading up to this moment. I ask her, as directly as I can manage, what exactly her ship intends to do, now that it has arrived. What answer this entire sector has been bracing itself for since that single point of light first appeared on my sensors. She regards me for a long moment before answering, and when she does, her tone remains exactly as calm as it was when she first stepped off the shuttle. "We're here to gather information," she says. "Nothing more than that, for now. I'd like to speak with Director Vorn, and with anyone who can provide an accurate account of what happened to the crew of the Quiet Harbor, and the circumstances surrounding their detention." I tell her that Director Vorn's forces have remained at a careful distance since her ship's arrival, declining to approach despite my attempts to relay information between both sides. She nods, unsurprised, as though this is exactly the response she expected. "That's fairly typical," she says. "He'll come to us eventually. People usually do, once they understand waiting any longer won't change the outcome." Her prediction proves accurate within hours. By early evening, Director Vorn himself requests permission to dock at Junction 11, a request that surprises me, given how thoroughly he avoided any direct contact with the human vessel over the previous 2 days. When his shuttle arrives, he steps off it alone, without the armed escort that accompanied him during the original seizure of the Quiet Harbor, and the change in his bearing is immediately apparent. The cold certainty that defined him during our first conversation has been replaced by something far more careful, almost cautious. The posture of a man who has finally understood that the situation has moved entirely beyond his control. I arrange a meeting room aboard Junction 11 for the conversation between Director Vorn and Representative Whitfield, and I am permitted to remain present, along with Hannah, as something closer to neutral witnesses than active participants. The room itself is unremarkable, a simple conference space we typically use for trade negotiations, and the contrast between its mundane furnishings and the weight of the conversation about to take place inside it strikes me as almost surreal. Whitfield does not raise her voice once during the entire exchange. She begins by asking Vorn, directly and without preamble, to explain the justification for the seizure of the quiet harbor. The same question I asked him weeks ago, and never received a satisfactory answer to. Vorn attempts, at first, to repeat the same official explanation he gave originally, citing an ongoing investigation into restricted cargo that was ultimately resolved without further action. Whitfield listens to this explanation in complete silence, and when he finishes, she simply asks him a single follow-up question. What restricted material was found aboard the vessel? The silence that follows stretches long enough to become genuinely uncomfortable. Vorn shifts in his seat, and for the first time since I have known him, I watch him struggle to find words at all. The investigation determined there was no violation, he says finally, the admission clearly costing him something significant to make. The seizure was conducted based on preliminary intelligence that proved inaccurate. Whitfield nods slowly, as though this confirms something she already suspected long before walking into this room. I see, she says. And whose decision was it to act on that preliminary intelligence without verification, given the diplomatic sensitivity of seizing a vessel from a species with no prior history of smuggling violations in this sector? Vorn hesitates again, and I watch something shift behind his eyes, a calculation taking place that I recognize instantly, even without understanding the full context of Krelthane command structure. He is deciding, in real time, whether to take responsibility for this decision himself, or to direct attention elsewhere. The decision was mine, he says eventually, and there is a strange kind of dignity in the admission, even given everything that led up to this moment. I authorized the boarding based on a report I did not adequately verify before acting. Whitfield studies him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then she says something that surprises me more than almost anything else that has happened over the past several days. Thank you for your honesty, she says. That matters, more than you probably realize right now. She explains, in the calm, measured tone she has maintained throughout the entire conversation, that her vessel's purpose was never to threaten Junction 11, the surrounding system, or the broader Krelthane fleet stationed throughout this sector. Her purpose, she explains, was simply to identify, through direct and verified investigation, exactly who was responsible for authorizing an unjustified seizure of human citizens, so that the matter could be resolved with precision, rather than broad, indiscriminate retaliation. We don't hold entire governments accountable for the decisions of individuals, she says. That approach causes far more harm than it resolves, and it rarely actually changes the behavior that caused the problem in the first place. What we do instead is identify the specific person responsible for a decision, and ensure that decision carries consequences proportional to the harm it caused. Nothing more and nothing less. I ask her, unable to stop myself, what those consequences will look like for Director Vorn now that he has admitted responsibility directly. She glances toward him before answering, and there is something almost compassionate in her expression, an unexpected gentleness given the gravity of the situation. That will largely depend on his own command structure, she says. We've already shared our findings with Krelthane Regional Command prior to this meeting. They're aware of the full circumstances surrounding the seizure, and aware that Director Vorn has now confirmed those circumstances directly. What happens next is, properly, a matter for his own chain of command to decide. As if summoned by her words, a priority transmission arrives for Director Vorn less than 20 minutes after the meeting concludes, relayed through Junction 11's communications array, directly from Krelthane Regional Headquarters. I am not present for the content of that transmission, but I watch Vorn's expression as he receives it through a private terminal in the corner of our conference room, and I do not need to hear the words to understand exactly what they contain. He is relieved of his command before the end of that same day, his patrol wing reassigned under new leadership, and a formal statement is issued by Krelthane Regional Command, acknowledging that the seizure of the quiet harbor was conducted without proper authorization or evidence, and that appropriate corrective action has been taken regarding the officer responsible. I watch all of this unfold with a strange sense of disbelief, the entire incident resolving not through any show of force, not through threat or ultimatum, but simply through patient, methodical investigation that places responsibility exactly where it belongs, and nowhere else. No shots are fired. No fleet engages another fleet. A single officer's career ends, quietly and completely, while everyone else connected to this incident, the rest of his patrol wing, the broader Krelthane fleet stationed throughout this sector, even Junction 11 itself, remains entirely untouched. I find Whitfield alone near the docking ring later that evening, preparing to return to her shuttle, and I ask her something that has been sitting uneasily in my mind since the meeting concluded. What would have happened, I ask, if Director Vorn had refused to take responsibility? If he had continued insisting the seizure was justified? She considers the question for a long moment before answering, and when she finally does, her voice carries the same calm certainty it has held throughout her entire visit, though something heavier moves beneath it now. We would have found the truth regardless, she says. It simply would have taken longer, and the consequences for him personally would likely have been more severe. Honesty, when offered freely, tends to be met with proportion. Denial, when maintained against clear evidence, tends not to be. I ask her one more question before she boards the shuttle, the same question that has haunted me since the very beginning of this entire incident. Is it true, I ask, what people say, about humans, about the rule everyone seems to know, without ever writing it down anywhere official? She smiles then, the first real smile I have seen from her during her entire visit, though there is something tired beneath it, something that suggests this is not the first time she has been asked this exact question. We're not looking for reasons to be angry, she says. We never have been. Most of the time, we'd genuinely rather just trade, and build, and be left to our own business the same as everyone else in this galaxy. But when someone takes something from us, or hurts someone under our protection without justification, we don't forget about it, and we don't let it go unanswered. We just don't see the need to be loud about how we answer it. She boards her shuttle, and within the hour, the human warship that has held this entire system motionless for nearly 3 days begins its slow withdrawal from the system, departing exactly as quietly as it arrived. I stand at the observation window one more time, watching that single point of light shrink and finally vanish from my sensor display entirely, and I find myself thinking, not for the first time over these past weeks, about everything I have learned and everything I still do not fully understand. Captain Donnelly and her crew are already long gone, continuing their route as though nothing had ever happened to interrupt it. Director Vorn's career has ended quietly, his name now attached to a cautionary report that will likely circulate through Krelthane command structures for years, as an example of exactly what not to do. The rest of this sector, the rest of this entire region of trade space, remains entirely untouched, exactly as it was before any of this began. And somewhere far beyond the edge of my system, a single ship that arrived without announcement and departed without ceremony has already moved on to whatever comes next, leaving behind nothing but a profound and lasting understanding that I suspect will never entirely leave me, no matter how many years pass between now and whatever I do next, with the rest of my career managing this small, quiet trade station on the edge of a galaxy that has just learned, once again, exactly why that old warning has survived for as long as it has. 3 months pass before I fully understand how much that single quiet incident actually changed, and the change does not arrive all at once. It arrives slowly, the way most real shifts in the galaxy do, through 1,000 small adjustments, rather than one dramatic announcement. The first sign comes through routine assembly correspondence, the kind of administrative document I usually skim through without much attention. This particular notice, however, catches my eye immediately, because it concerns updated protocols for any interaction between member species and human vessels or citizens. The language is careful and deliberately bureaucratic, the kind of wording designed to avoid drawing too much attention to exactly what prompted it, but the intent is unmistakable to anyone who lived through the past several months the way I did. The new protocols establish mandatory verification procedures before any boarding or seizure action can be taken against a vessel registered to any species, with specific additional safeguards outlined for situations involving human registry. Any officer authorizing such an action without sufficient verified cause now faces immediate review by both their own command structure and a newly formed oversight committee within the assembly itself. I read through the entire document twice, recognizing in its careful, deliberate language the unmistakable shadow of Director Vorn's quiet, complete downfall. I am not the only one who notices the shift. Lucas Renner contacts me not long after the protocols are published, his tone considerably lighter than it was during those tense weeks when he warned me to collect every Krelthane debt before something arrived to make collecting them impossible. Told you, he writes, with the particular satisfaction of someone who guessed correctly about something most people doubted. Quiet, precise, and over before most of the galaxy even understood what was happening. I've already resumed full operations through your sector. Figured you'd want to know business is picking back up. I find myself smiling at his message, genuinely relieved for the first time in months that the tension which had settled so thoroughly into my chest finally seems to be lifting. Human trade routes, which had quietly withdrawn from this entire stretch of the sector during the height of the crisis, begin returning as well, slowly and methodically, exactly the way they left. Within 2 months, traffic through Junction 11 has returned almost entirely to its previous levels, with one notable addition that I do not expect, and that moves me more than I anticipated when it finally arrives. The quiet harbor docks at my station again, on a routine cargo run, exactly as it has dozens of times over the past several years before any of this began. Captain Claire Donnelly requests permission to come aboard the station briefly, not for any official business, simply to speak with me directly, and I find myself genuinely glad to see her when she finally steps through the airlock. She looks exactly as composed as she did during that very first feed, calm in a way I now understand far better than I did 3 months ago, when I mistook that calm for something unsettling, rather than recognizing it for the quiet certainty it actually represented. "I wanted to thank you," she tells me, once we're settled in the same small observation lounge where I first watched her dead, dark ship sitting silently at my docking ring, "for the way you handled things, back when all of this started. You didn't have to push back against Vorn the way you did. Most station administrators would have just let it happen and stayed out of it entirely." I tell her honestly that my protest accomplished very little in the moment, that the assembly dismissed my objection almost as quickly as I raised it, and that her crew sat in Krelthane custody for nearly a week regardless of anything I said or did on her behalf. She shakes her head, gently but firmly disagreeing with my assessment. "It mattered," she says. "Every piece of information gets recorded somewhere, even the protests that get dismissed in the moment. When Representative Whitfield's team reviewed everything that happened, your formal objection was part of what confirmed the seizure had no legitimate justification from the very beginning. You didn't have the power to stop it, but you made sure it was documented honestly, and that honesty mattered more than you probably realize." I sit with that for a long moment, genuinely surprised by how much it means to hear, given how powerless I felt throughout most of this entire incident. I ask her, finally, the question I have wanted to ask since that very first day, when I watched her marched off her own ship, with an expression that betrayed no fear at all. "Weren't you afraid?" I ask. "During the seizure itself? You looked so calm, the entire time." She considers the question carefully before answering, and when she finally does, her voice carries the same quiet certainty I have come to associate with everyone connected to that single, unannounced warship. "I was afraid," she admits. "Anyone would be, in that situation. But I also knew, with complete certainty, exactly what would happen once word reached the right people. Not because I'm special, or because my crew was particularly important, because that's simply how it works, for all of us. We trust that an unjustified action against any one of us will be answered, properly and precisely, even if we ourselves never live to see it happen. That trust is worth more than fear can take away." I think about her words long after she leaves, returning to her ship and continuing on with the same quiet, unremarkable life she led before any of this began. I think about Mara Voss, still working in my engineering bay every day, who once told me I did not want to see what happened after humans stopped talking, and who turned out to be entirely correct, though not in the way I originally expected. I think about Eleanor Whitfield, calm and gentle even in the moment she ended a man's entire career, with nothing more than a few careful questions. I think about Director Vorn himself, whose name I still occasionally hear mentioned in passing trade conversations, always in the same cautious, careful tone people use when discussing a mistake they hope never to repeat themselves. I find Voss in the engineering bay one evening, several months after everything has finally settled, and I ask her the same question I have been carrying since that long, tense night when the silence first began to spread across this entire sector. Was it always going to end that way? I ask her, quietly, precisely, without anyone being hurt who didn't directly cause the problem. She considers the question for a long moment, setting down her tools the way she did during our very first conversation about all of this, and when she finally answers, there is something almost wistful in her voice. "Mostly, yes," she says. "It doesn't always go that smoothly. Sometimes people refuse to take responsibility, the way Director Vorn could have, and things get considerably more complicated when that happens. But the goal is always precision. Find exactly who made the decision, hold them accountable, leave everyone else entirely alone. It's not about punishing an entire species or government for the actions of one person who overstepped their authority. It never has been." I ask her why, given how effective and precise this approach seems to be. The wider galaxy still seems to treat humans as the unfinished guest at the table, tolerated more than respected, watched more than trusted, despite everything that has happened over the past 3 months. She smiles at that, a genuine, easy smile that I do not see from her often. Give it time, she says. Reputations like that take longer to shift than people expect. But word travels, eventually, the same way it traveled to Lucas Renner, and to you, and to every other trader and administrator who's been quietly retelling this story to their colleagues over the past few months. One incident like this gets people talking. Talking turns into understanding, eventually. And understanding, given enough time, turns into respect. I think about her words often over the following weeks, as Junction 11 settles back into the same steady, unremarkable rhythm it maintained for years, before any of this began. Trade continues. Ships dock and depart. The old rhythms of station life return almost entirely to normal, and most days, if I did not actively choose to remember it, I could almost convince myself the entire incident never happened at all. But I do choose to remember it, deliberately, because I believe it matters that someone does. I begin including a small addition to every onboarding document I issue to new staff joining Junction 11. A single line placed prominently at the very top of the page, above every other procedure and protocol the document contains. It is not an official assembly regulation. It carries no legal weight whatsoever. It is simply something I believe every person working on this station deserves to understand clearly, from their very first day, long before they ever have reason to test whether it is actually true. Treat every species docking at this station with fairness and respect, regardless of how small or new their presence in this galaxy might seem to you. Power is not always measured by size, or by the number of ships a fleet can field, or by how long a species has existed among the stars. Sometimes it is measured by patience, by precision, and by a quiet, unwavering certainty that an unjustified wrong will always, eventually, be answered. I think of Felix Doran often these days, the old trader who first told me about this rule years ago, back when I still believed it was nothing more than a colorful story spacers told each other to make a quiet shift feel more exciting. I wonder sometimes whether he ever witnessed anything like what I witnessed over those 3 tense, unforgettable months. Whether his own warning came from first-hand experience, or simply from the same careful retelling that has now, in turn, become my own story to pass along. Either way, I no longer laugh at the warning the way I once did. I carry it with me now, the same quiet certainty that Captain Donnelly carried during her own detention, the same patient understanding that Mara Voss has clearly held for years longer than I have known her, the same calm precision that Eleanor Whitfield demonstrated in a small conference room aboard my own station, ending an entire career with nothing more than a few careful, honest questions. The galaxy is vast, filled with species far older, far larger, and far more established than humanity has ever claimed to be. But somewhere out among those countless stars, an old rule continues to hold true, quiet and unspoken in most circles, yet understood completely by anyone who has ever lived through exactly what happens when it gets tested. Do not anger the humans. Not because of what they will say, not because of how loudly they will respond, but because, when they finally decide to answer, they will do so with a precision and patience that no amount of size or strength could ever truly prepare you for, and by the time you understand exactly what that answer looks like, you will already be standing inside it, wondering, the same way I once did, how you never saw it coming. I still manage Junction 11 today, the same quiet, unremarkable trade station I have called home for years now. Ships continue to dock and depart, cargo continues to move through our holds, and most days pass exactly as uneventfully as they always have. But I watch every interaction a little more carefully now than I once did, and I make certain every new arrival to this station understands, clearly and from the very beginning, exactly why that old unwritten rule has survived for as long as it has, and exactly why it likely always will.